Right now, I want to go directly to this week's presentation because there's a lot to cover, and introduce to you Maya Karrow, who is the staff attorney for Safe Passage for Children, and is here with us for a year under the Archbishop Ireland Justice Fellowship program, and she has been the main driver of a year-long study on child fatalities due to maltreatment in Minnesota. So what we're going to do for you, our loyal followers, is to give you a preview of the information that's going to be in the final report, which we hope will be done in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll probably release it right after the first of the year so we can not get caught up in the holiday season and get the information lost. But this study, which was basically funded by Kathleen Blatz and Greg Page through the St. Thomas School of Law, is looking at child fatalities that have happened since the Governor's Task Force on Child Protection in 2015. Tons of data, lots of people involved. I'll let Maya explain that all to you. Maya Karrow, some of you may remember her from the last presentation when she was Maya Schulte, but she recently got married, so congratulations on that. And that is about all I want to say. I want to let you run with it, Maya, because there's some great information. We do want to leave a little time at the end for Q&A. So go ahead, Maya.
Alrighty. As Rich said, my name is Maya Karrow, and I am the staff attorney with Safe Passage, primarily working on the project involving child fatalities in Minnesota. Before I go, you can just see my presentation screen, right? Like you're not seeing my notes? Okay. Okay.
I'm not sure about the notes part. I think we can see your notes. Or no, I see just 2 of the same thing up there. So one is small and one is large. So I think.
Okay.
Yeah, you're all right.
What about now?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the full screen, Maya. That looks
Okay,
great.
thank you. Thank you. All right, sorry about that. So to just jump right in into an overview of our project, as Rich said, I previously did a webinar that kind of goes more into the objectives and how we went about doing things, but in general, the purpose of the project is to better understand the factors related to child deaths from maltreatment in Minnesota, particularly regarding policies and practice related to family preservation and family assessment, with the goal of identifying where improved resources or changes in policies and practices can reduce the rate of child fatalities. So a brief overview of our methods. Our sample size consists of 88 children that were killed in Minnesota or had child protection history in Minnesota prior to the child dying out of state. There's only 2 cases where that applies. And the time frame is the end of 2014 to May of 2022. We know obviously that there's more child fatalities, obviously more than 88, and we can compare our number to a child fatality inventory that was provided to us by the Department of Human Services. And in that inventory, they said there was 161 child fatalities from maltreatment in the same time frame. So our sample is about 50% of that. In terms of where we got our data from, the majority of it comes from court records from MNCIS. So basically the public access terminals at different county courthouses you can access criminal records, juvenile records, family courts, all of that. And then secondly, we were able to get child fatality reports from different county agencies pursuant to a Minnesota statute. And the statute basically says that if a child died in your county, Upon request, they have to disclose a certain set of information, including the child's age, gender, their family history with child protection. So that'll include family assessments, investigations, and then the disposition of those assessments. We did not get child fatality reports for every single case. We didn't get them for all 88. We got them for 55, so about 61.4% of cases. We were unable to get reports from cases with pending litigation. We were unable to get ICWA cases or cases under Indian or tribal jurisdiction. Those aren't public. We don't have access to them. And then apart from, those, we also, there's some cases in which, there isn't pending litigation, but just the county didn't respond even after, several attempts. So we also had counties really range in how they responded to our requests. Some went out of their way to show support for our project and our objectives, and would even provide additional cases that we previously didn't have on our radar. Some did the bare minimum and would have information that was inconsistent with the public record. Some didn't respond at all, as I had said. But then after we collected everything, we coded the 88 cases into one large spreadsheet with 84 different elements. There were 4 coders to maintain iterator reliability. That coded 30% of the cases, and I coded every case. So another kind of side component of this project is what we have kind of coined the term subject matter experts. So basically, a few months back, we were finishing up coding cases and I was starting to mine the data. Kind of came up with a whole nother idea to, as part of our data analysis, to get different, to form different groups from different areas within the child welfare realm, you could say, in order to get a more well-rounded look into these cases. And I will say credit is due to Maggie Carney for, kind of sparking this idea or encouraging us to do this. She had reached out to us about helping out with safe passage in some capacity from a medical point of view. That's Maggie's expertise. And so I had sent her case materials and she responded with some really interesting insight and pointed out issues that we hadn't seen. And then from there, we decided we needed to get input from other areas. So we have medical, law enforcement, child welfare, courts, guardian ad litem, and domestic violence. We did have a few other areas that we wanted to include, but we weren't able to find people available to basically volunteer their time to do this. But this involved us, we picked 15 cases that presented a wide range of issues, and we assigned 4 or 5 cases to each group for them to review. We sent them 3 or 4 documents. Some of them were CHIPS petitions, criminal complaints, fatality reports, order for protections. Basically, they use that information to answer a set of questions pertaining to how they think the case was handled. And, in regard to best practices, child safety. And then either the group sent us their report, or in other instances, I met with groups via Zoom and they would just discuss the reports or discuss the cases and I would take notes. So basically we will use, the input from these subject matter experts throughout our report in order to kind of build rapport on a specific issue. To jump right into some of our findings, these are just some basic demographics. The green chart on the left is the age at the time of death for 88 cases. So as you'll see, 42% of our cases were under 1 year of age. consistent with national findings and also consistent with research that shows the risk of being a homicide victim is highest during your first year of life. Children under the age of 4 comprise 78% of our data, compared to a similar 76.3% on a national level. In terms of gender, we had 57 boys and 31 girls, and our numbers are a bit higher, or we have more boys in our study than the national average. The national average is about 60% male, 40% female. In terms of race, this chart shows the race of the 88 deceased children. Some things to point out with this, 26% of the fatalities were Black children. And while this, could be comparable to other races, if you look at their overall makeup in the child protection system, they make up only 18% of the child protection population, but 26% of fatalities. Whereas if you compare that to white children, they make up almost 50% of the child protection population and only 24% of the child fatalities. I'd also like to point out our high number of unknown cases. Race was an incredibly hard element to track. Not every single CHIPS petition or juvenile record tracks race of children, and it's not one of the required disclosures in the statute. So unfortunately, this was just an element that we couldn't get for every case. And I think kind of points to a larger problem because obviously race is a significant factor that we need to consider. Relationship to child. So this chart refers to the main person responsible for the child fatality. So whether there was criminal charges filed or a finding of maltreatment against the person. There are some cases that had multiple perpetrators, but again, this chart is only showing the primary person, so the person who had the most severe charge or sentence. There are a few cases, there's 3 cases where 2 people were found equally responsible, at least in terms of the criminal court under the criminal law, meaning they were charged and convicted of the same crime and given the same sentence. As you can see, mothers and fathers were responsible for about 50% of cases, but then we were also really surprised to see that a significant amount of the fatalities were a non-parent perpetrator. So in 47.7% of cases, the person primarily responsible was someone other than the child's biological parents. The biggest category being domestic partners, so almost 24% were killed by the mother's significant other. There were 9 children that were killed in foster care, 8 of which were kinship foster placements. And then about 8% were killed by a caregiver, a few of those being a relative caregiver, so an uncle, a brother, an aunt, and then a few of those being a non-relative caregiver, so a friend of the parents, a babysitter, a child care provider. So to jump into our child welfare analysis, obviously this is a huge chunk of our report and we're looking into a lot of different issues. We don't have time to go through every single one of those. So we identified a few that we thought we would share with you. And the next few slides will kind of highlight how we are formatting this in our report as well. Basically we're presenting an issue, providing our statistics on it, backup research, and then we are using 1 or 2 case narratives to kind of to highlight or narrate a specific issue. So one theme that we ran into was inappropriate assignment to family assessment. So this first family was a family with 6 children, and there were 9 reports made to child protection prior to the fatality, 6 of which were family assessments. There were 3 different child welfare county agencies involved with this family. So like I said, there was 9 reports. I'm only including a couple of these, so just keep that in mind. There's a lot more that went on with this family. So the first one, report that the children were left alone in a car in the Walmart parking lot in 90-degree weather. This was assigned to family assessment. A report that a 9-year-old child was found wandering the streets asking for help because her mom had hit her on the head with a coffee mug and broke the mug. An ambulance service ended up checking the child out, and they found a goose egg, injury on her head, and they took her into the ER. At the ER, the child reported that the mother hits her with a stake on the back and that she hits her daily. Law enforcement went to the family home and they tried calling the mom, and they were unsuccessful. They were unable to find her. Though it was later reported she was at home, but was just unwilling to answer the phone at the door. The child was put on a police hold and placed in emergency foster care. So this situation was initially accepted as an investigation, but it later was changed to a family assessment. And the child was returned to mother's care at some point. And then another report, the mom had a court appearance, and at that court appearance, she was taken into custody on an outstanding warrant in a different county. And at that time, the county ordered that the children be taken into custody. The county asked where the children were, and the mom wouldn't disclose where they were. The younger 3 children were later found in the mom's car in the parking lot of the courthouse, dripping sweat. 1 child was lethargic and unresponsive. They were taken to the ER. It was estimated they were alone in the car for 3 hours. They reported that they hadn't eaten since the day before. They slept in the car the night before. And then at that point, the children were taken into custody, emergency custody, and placed into a foster home. The mom was charged with child endangerment. So this incident was accepted as an investigation, as it should be. And then after this, the record kind of gets a little fuzzy as to what exactly was going on. The kids were removed, but then they kept ending, they'd be back in mom's care, which eventually led to child's 6th death. So basically, the agency received a report that mom had given birth to child 6. So the next day, they tried to make contact with the mother. They went to the mother's house to try to meet with mom and the child. Law enforcement was there at some point, but then left. But then at that point, the social workers watched the mom leave with a bunch of stuff and all the children and get into a car and take off. But I don't think they, really had the authority to do anything, or believed they didn't. And then 1 week later, CPS received a report that mother had been in a car accident in a different state with child 6. Child 6 was, I think, 3 months old, and had been on a pillow in the car and passed away. So this just highlights kind of an overuse of family assessment. I kind of realize now I never really even went over what family assessment is. There's the traditional, what you think of traditional investigation into child maltreatment, where they're making a maltreatment determination as to, whether abuse occurred, whereas a family assessment is supposed to be for low risk cases, voluntary services, no maltreatment determination, etc. Another pattern we found throughout would be returning children home from foster care too soon or before their biological parents or home is fit or ready. So this case, in October 2020, mother brought 4-month-old child 1 into the doctor Medical examination revealed a fracture dislocation on the victim's elbow, additional fractures on the victim's wrists, ankles, ribs, and knees, and a laceration on his face. So CPS did investigate this matter, and the mom was charged with felony malicious punishment of a child and third-degree assault. And the child and the child's siblings were then placed in foster care. They were eventually returned to mother's care, and 8 weeks after they were back with the mother, the child was severely beaten and smothered to death by his mother. So this, returning kids home from foster care, apart from the 9 children killed while they were in foster care, there's 9 cases in which the child was previously in foster care and then returned home and ultimately killed. So this is obviously an area that we're focusing on. Missed or dismissed red flags. This case
My God.
was a 2-month-old infant died by blunt force trauma while in the care of his mother. And this case didn't, initially raise any red flags until I really read into the criminal complaint. There was a well baby check just 6 days before the child was killed. And at that well baby check, the doctor noticed a rash on the child's, a significant portion of the child's body, and there were dark bruise marks on the infant's left arm. And when asked, the mother just said that there were puppies running around in her house and they may have stepped on the infant's arm. At the time of death, or the infant's autopsy revealed healing rib fractures and multiple skull fractures. So this is just an example, as what I had presented at the beginning with subject matter experts. This was an example of a case that we, having someone with a medical background can provide a lot more expertise and point out issues that we didn't necessarily see for ourselves. Another big area would be child torture. I would say we were pretty surprised by the amount of cases that we included in our study that involved child torture. We had 16 cases that could be classified as child torture. It had elements of child torture, so it's 18.2%. We did consult 2 experts in the field regarding these cases and child torture in general. And one said that, child torture is becoming a lot more prevalent. Such cases weren't really around until maybe 10 or 15 years ago, which corresponds with, when family assessment practices began and became, kind of overtook the child protection system, which we found interesting. So basically, in terms of how we came to whether a case was classified as child torture, we asked coders to make the determination, does this case involve child torture? And we provided definitions in the coding manual. First definition coming from the National Center of Child Abuse Statistics and Policy. So child torture includes a combination of 2 or more of the cruel and inhumane treatments for protracted periods of time, such as intentionally starving and binding the child, intentionally starving the child, binding or restraining the child, repeat physical or sexual abusing the child, exposing the child to extreme temperatures without adequate clothing, locking the child in closets or other small spaces, forcing the child to eat excrements or have sexual contact with animals, or forcing the child into stress positions. A couple more definitions of torture. Minnesota statute definition of torture is the intentional infliction of extreme mental anguish or extreme psychological or physical abuse when committed in a especially depraved manner. It's a pretty broad definition, and I don't really think there's clear parameters on what would constitute torture under this statute. And then there's also the Knox definition, which, we had discussed with the experts, and it's a longitudinal experience characterized by at least 2 physical assaults or 1 extended assault. through more forms of psychological maltreatment and neglect, resulting in prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement, or dysfunction or death. So basically, these each kind of have a different threshold for whether it can be considered child torture. We put this chart together to kind of try to show, how some cases across the line, there's 4 cases that would meet all 3 definitions of torture, whereas, other cases meet a few, some cases only meet 1. I would say this is still kind of an area that Rich and I are hashing out, but it was something we wanted to share with you today, just because such a high percentage of our cases had these elements. And to kind of put it into perspective, a case narrative on a case that was classified as torture. So this was a 3-year-old foster care child who died at the hands of her foster parents. The foster parents admitted that they regularly bound the child in several sheets and blankets to completely inhibit her ability to move. And then they would wrap the tail end of the final blanket around the bed rail, securing her to the bed so she couldn't escape. And they would leave the child for hours at a time. They called this a burrito technique. And it was used on a daily basis, often 2 or 3 times a day. And it was a technique that ultimately led to the child's death. Prior to being placed with her foster parents, the child presented as a normal infant, in the 75th percentile for weight and 75th percentile for, 75th percentile for height, 95th percentile for weight. And then 1 month prior to her death, the child was taken into the doctor and she had regressed to the 5th percentile for height and the 10th percentile for weight. So at 3 years old, she weighed 23 pounds. Also at the time of her death, she had 2 different drugs in her system with sedating effects. That was another way that the foster parents dealt with her. Her electrolyte levels revealed that she was extremely dehydrated. She had bruises covering her body, and she obviously looked extremely malnourished. Witnesses had said the foster parents would limit her food because she was overweight. So yeah, just, I guess, an example of some pretty horrific stuff. We also obviously have a criminal court section within our paper. Similar to what I said before, there's a ton of different issues that we've explored with this, and we don't have time to go into every single one. Some of, yes, I put a couple of 4 of them on here. Some of the different themes we went through, disparities in prosecuting the passive parent. So just one case, a mom will be charged with child endangerment or child neglect once they find out that she knew that the father was abusing the child. Whereas in another case, we'll present almost equal facts where a party knew that the abuse was happening and didn't do anything to stop it. So disparities in that. Delays in criminal charges and its impact on child safety. We know there's delays in criminal court in cases across the board, but I would kind of argue for child fatality cases specifically, these delays impact child safety because a lot of times the child's siblings will remain in the home because the juvenile court will be waiting for, criminal charges to be filed. We also looked at domestic abuse and related charges, so perpetrators being charged with domestic assaults, violating OFPs or an order for protection, violating a domestic abuse no contact order, all these happening in a timeline right up until a child fatality or a child dies in the home. And then lastly, we looked at the interplay between criminal court and juvenile court. And this next slide will kind of explain what I'm saying here. So a case narrative, child A was an infant who was born alive but died as a result of complications from their mother's use of alcohol during pregnancy. Mother reported on the day of the child's birth, she drank 1 liter of whiskey, felt contractions and passed out. When she woke, she found the child between her legs with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. Child A was born at 33 weeks gestation. Prior to child A's birth and death, there were 6 reports made to CPS regarding this mother. 1 report regarding prenatal exposure of an unborn child, an older sibling of the deceased. A referral was made in lieu of child protection because the child was under 34 weeks gestation. Another report that mom was passed out on the couch with her 2 young children unattended. This report was assigned to family assessment. And then there were 3 subsequent reports made to child protection about mother consuming alcohol during her pregnancy with child A, and all 3 of those reports were ruled out because the child was under 34 weeks gestation. Regardless of this, the mother was charged and convicted for 2nd-degree manslaughter. So I bring this case to show that, child protection knew that this mother was using alcohol while pregnant, but they were unable to do anything because of the rules that they're not, since the child was under 34 weeks. Whereas in criminal court, they found that a child at 33 weeks would be considered a child and the mother could be prosecuted for that crime. So just pointing out kind of inconsistencies with the 2 different court systems. Next steps, I think Rich touched on this a little bit, but we are in the process of finishing up our report. It is quite a beast, a ton of information. We could probably write like 10 different reports or papers out of so many different, subjects and themes that we saw. So yeah, it's quite the process, but we're excited to see the final product. So I'd open it up for any questions or comments.
So this is Judy Schumacher. I'm a board member. Maya, I don't know how you did this. First of all, it's one of the most depressing reports I've ever heard. Is it not a state law that counties must report the deaths of children? Every county? It sounds like there's a great discrepancy among counties.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for this, because I kind of feel like in the process of collecting our child fatalities from different counties, we did get, I don't know if the counties that didn't respond, if there wasn't a child fatality report done. There is a law mandated that they're supposed to report any child fatality within 24 hours of the death to the Department of Human Services. But again, I don't think we can say if we know that that's consistently happening.
So if it's reported, Maya, does that mean that it's public knowledge?
No. So if it's reported to the Department of Human Services, they have that information, and it really, the family's child protection history is public knowledge, but that involves knowing the name of the child who died and knowing the name of the parents and being able to go and look at that. So a big problem that we ran into is we could really only identify cases that are reported in the media, in order to identify those cases. Whereas, we know there's 161 cases, but we don't have the names, or there's no way to identify those cases.
Yeah, maybe I can clarify a little. For several years now, Safe Passage has been asking the department of Human Services to share their inventory. And after a lot of effort, the department decided to give us the number of children who had died during the same time period, but they did not want to share any other information. So we weren't able to, and I think I see a question that just popped up. And so I'm actually, from Linda, I'm actually answering the question now. We weren't able to identify any of the children that didn't show up in the media because the department would only tell us that the year of the death and the county or something like that. So we couldn't go and get the rest of the information from court records or by requesting that the county give us a fatality report. You know, as many of you know, I spent 25 years in state and county human services agencies, most of that on the executive team. So I was in the room when questions like this would be discussed, and every other place that I've been a part of or that I've consulted with basically has a philosophy, just get the information out there and let the chips fall where they may, as opposed to trying to keep the information, you know, behind the curtains and not share it. So my position with the department has been, you're better off just sharing this information, getting it out there rather than trying to embargo it. So we, however, having said that, 55 or 88 cases out of the total of 161 is more than an adequate sample to represent the whole. So I don't think that it affected our findings and conclusions at all, but it did affect our ability to, you know, to get raw numbers, some of which, you know, when you look at torture, for example, our experts said never used to be torture until 10 or 15 years ago. And now look at the number we have. We have 16 with elements of torture and, you know, half a dozen cases where everybody agrees in clear-cut cases. It's important to have that information. And also it's important to look like you're, you know, not withholding information from the public. So, but they did at least give us that inventory number, so we knew what we were dealing with as the total population. And I know there's some people from the department on the call, and I appreciate you being here. I'm sorry if that's uncomfortable at all, but it's just an issue that has to be talked through.
Maya, have you come to any conclusions yet about creating ways to prevent child abuse? I know you are investigating abuse that's already happened and the deaths of children, but are things that may be looked at? Did you come across anything consistently that might be looked at as a way to prevent child abuse? It's kind of a long shot given what your subject matter is, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would just say in general, you know, we were kind of, a lot of this was about us seeing how, you know, what was happening with these children when they were in the child protection system. You know, so where cases are assigned to family assessment a lot, and they keep getting assigned to family assessment, where the family is showing no track of correcting the wrong that, you know, brought them there in the first place, and they keep assigning them to a low risk category. They're not investigating. So I would say in terms of, you know, recommendations on how we can make it better, there's other states that do, you know, alternative response family assessment, but it's less, there's more procedures in place, such as, you know, if there's one family assessment, they can only have one family assessment and then it's an investigation, you know, so a rule like that could have prevented a large number of fatalities in our study if you look at how many of them were constantly just being, you know, sent to voluntary services where the parents aren't mandated to follow up with that type of, yeah. So I don't know if maybe Rich has a better.
Well, I think, you know, the basic theme, and you'll be familiar with this if you followed it, is the heavy focus on family preservation and on reunifying families is, I think, and you would have to do a study that's, way above my, my pay level to prove this. But when in looking at these and all the cases over the years, it's just clear that we are leaving them in situations where they are at extreme risk. And then we're returning them from foster care or rather out of home placement before anything has changed, because there's such a premium put on family preservation. And family preservation doesn't mean a lot when the child gets killed, right? I mean, early on in the days of Safe Passage, I'll never forget, this county director said to me, he's now retired, but he said, well, if there's a situation in which the parents kill one of the children, of course, we remove the other siblings right away, but we return them as soon as possible unless there's a good reason not to. And I think that sums up philosophy as well as anything I can say. And another similar example, during the governor's task force, we had testimony from one of the leaders of the county association, and Kathleen Blatz famously said, well, what would you do in a family assessment case if you went out and found that there was, and figured out there was sexual abuse going on? And the person said, well, we wouldn't do anything about that because it would be unfair to the parents. So I know those two examples. Oh my God. Those are anecdotal, but if you read this report, and Maya, covered this at a high level, and so you could look at each slide and say, well, there might be reasons that this didn't work or that didn't work. But if you read the report, I think it's overwhelming. It's just overwhelming amount of data and number of cases that show that we are about protecting adults and about respecting their concerns to the point where we
yes, it is. I'm
giving adequate.
Goodbye.
We're not giving adequate consideration to the safety of the child. I'd like to say that more softly, but I don't think I can do that in all honesty. We found, major themes like not only inappropriate assignment to family assessment, but just inaction in the case of chronic long-term abuse and neglect. Failing to monitor open child protection cases, no safety plan. You send a kid to a situation that's really, really high risk, and there's no safety plan in place. The red flags were missed by medical providers. The one torture case that Maya talked about, the child went in and she'd gone from the top percentiles in terms of height and weight to the bottom percentiles, and that wasn't picked up on. It's possible it was picked up by the medical provider. We can't really tell, but it didn't result in any action by the county child protection people. Really striking was the high percentage of children in foster care who were killed. That's 10%, and almost all of them were in kinship foster care. So this basically, along with the Citizens Review Panel in Hennepin County did a report on this, and the conclusion that we both came to is that we aren't doing due diligence in terms of kinship placements. We're just kind of putting kids in the first available relative. And then, again, the alarming number of cases that included elements of torture or just, 100% agreement across the board that was torture involved, when this was not even an issue 10 or 15 years ago. So,
comment if I may.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, and introduce yourself too, Greg, please.
Yeah, I'm one of the board members for Safe Passage, and I'm a retired child protection investigation supervisor. I worked in child protection for 40 years prior to my retirement. And and I know Maggie already made a comment in the chat box area, but just to support what she was saying, torture has always been a part of child protection and child maltreatment. Over the 40 years that I worked, there were cases involving torture when I was doing my field placement when I was in graduate school. So it's always been there. I think it's largely a matter of how it's defined, how it's tracked, how it's reported. But I know experientially, it's always been there.
Well, I think you're right, Greg. We don't really have a comparison number. And I was really going based on a conversation with one of the experts, Dee Wilson, in this, who was saying that he'd spent 25 years in state agencies and training people in social work school, and he had very few cases of torture in his opinion. But we can't really pin that down. So I think you're right, and Maggie's right as well. What we really need to do is say, look, here's what leads to these particular cases of torture, and what practice changes do we need to make to intervene in time to, keep the kid from being tortured to death, rather than.
The other comment I'd like to make too is just the one anecdotal comment you made, Rich, and I'm not disputing the accuracy of the comment about if we go out there for report A and it's family assessment and something about sexual abuse comes up, we don't address it because it'd be unfair to the parent. That I would say would be a real outlier in terms of my experience with child protection investigations. We always viewed whatever the presenting problem was as just that, the presenting problem. And when our investigation workers would do a family investigation / assessment, depending upon which track it might be on, we would always train our workers and expect our workers to do a complete assessment. So whatever the presenting problem was just kind of like an entry point into the family system. And from there, we would do a full assessment of physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. We'd cover the broad spectrum. That was just standard practice, at least where I worked.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for not getting defensive and pushing back harder, because I probably deserved it. But I would say, and I would say Greg was one of our subject matter experts, as was Maggie Carney. And is there anybody else on the call that was? So we got a lot of good feedback, but I'm not sure that you're not the outlier. Hennepin County isn't the outlier on this, Greg, because I've seen so much and heard so much in terms of all the meetings I've been in with Maxa and other folks, just basically defending these practices. But I would just say, when we get the full report, read it. And I think that you will see these patterns that I'm talking about, even though the kind of approach that you just used is the kind that, when I was supervising child protection units years ago, that's the way we did business too. But I'm not, I'd be interested in, when you read the full report, if you think maybe your approach isn't the one that is representative of the philosophy statewide.
Are there too often you hear about police officers going to a house and not being allowed in, and then not necessarily going back to try again. Is there a requirement for people who, like law enforcement, who, if they find no one home or if no one answers the door, to follow up on that or not?
Greg, you might be more knowledgeable on that point.
Yeah, again, it may vary a lot from county to county and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but at least in my experience, law enforcement, child protection had a good cooperative relationship. And if law enforcement itself was not following up, they would make the referral to us and we would follow up and then report back to law enforcement if necessary. So I'd say by and large, my experience is that there was always some kind of follow-up by some part of the system.
Good, thanks.
My understanding, Greg, and check me on this, is that the police can't actually force their way into a house. If the person won't open the door, then they have to go get the court to get some kind of a warrant or whatever determines to go in. And similarly, child protection has the same issue. Does that sound correct?
Well, child protection certainly has less authority to go into a home than law enforcement does. Child protection can only go in with permission from the family. And I'm not an expert on the law enforcement part of it, but from my understanding of working with law enforcement quite a bit, is that if they really felt that there was some person, be it an adult or a child, that was in immediate danger, they can enter the premise. If they don't see an immediate life and death type emergency situation, then in order to enter the premise, they'd have to get a search warrant.
Well, and I would say also your point about it varies across the state. One of the torture cases that's very similar to the one that Maya presented, the Elk River Police went to this home 31 times and never entered, even though neighbors gave them recordings of the girl screaming. And it's not clear if they ever cross-reported to Child Protection. So I think one of the big issues is a lack of clear standard protocol statewide, a lack of about what police should do and about how police and Child Protection should communicate. So I think, when last time I was involved with Hennepin, they had done a lot of work with all of there's 30 some law enforcement agencies in Hennepin County, and they've done a lot of work to establish standard protocols with them, including how to reach people after hours and, a lot of details like that. But I don't know that, but there seems to be quite a bit of information over the years that we've had that every local law enforcement agency, has their own way of doing business. So there's a case to be made for standardizing some protocols. Apropos of Judy's remark, I think it takes kind of a toll on you to do this report. And I think Maya's kind of
I
held
can
up
imagine.
remarkably well. But it's not without its own secondary trauma.
I'm sure of that.
So, for those listening, and especially if you have any skepticism, when the report comes out, I just encourage you to read it. And I think you see that it's well documented, and particularly with the help we've got, 19 subject matter experts to make sure we were on track. I think you'll find the results, the findings are solid.
I missed the beginning of the discussion. The report was commissioned for what purpose and by whom?
It was, this is through, Maya is a Ireland Justice Fellow, Archbishop Ireland Justice Fellow from the University of St. Thomas School of Law. So recently graduated, recently on the bar. So it's a 1-year kind of like a clerkship almost. And it was funded by Kathleen Blatz and Greg Page. So they basically put up the money. We were supposed to match the money, but they put it all up. So otherwise we would not have been able to do it.
But it was about child fatalities.
Yeah. So the project that we proposed was this one, to do a study of child fatalities. Since, as many of you remember, Brandon Stahl was a reporter for the Star Tribune, and he did a study of child fatalities from 2006 to 2014 that was the basis that kind of triggered the Governor's Task Force on Child Protection in 2015, which in turn led to a number of reforms, but a number of the reforms that were recommended haven't been done, but basically that was the inventory. So we tried to pick up from where he left off and bring it up to the present.
Thank you.
This is Bob Storley. I'm a longtime supporter of Safe Passage and been very impressed with the work you guys have done, Rich. Maya, I need to commend you for battling through this. It had to be pretty tough sledding, both with the content and then the reluctance of agencies to share data. I was a little bit late in getting on here too, and the 88 figure, is that since 2014? 88 fatalities?
It's from the tail end of 2014. So any case that wasn't included in Brandon Stahl's report. So I think it's October of 2014 until May of 2022 is our timeline.
And where does 161 come in?
161 is, we had reached out to the Department of Human Services to try, to get an idea of what the actual number of child fatalities is in Minnesota. And they gave us an inventory of child fatalities from maltreatment by county and there was 161 in the same, just about the same time frame.
Wow, that's depressing.
Mhm.
And these numbers are due to documented maltreatment.
Yeah, so
Right,
And-
it's not
yeah.
accidental drownings or stuff, things of that nature, or car accidents.
That would not be included, right?
No, these are deaths, these are fatalities from maltreatment.
Wow. Rich, quick question for you. Do you think things have substantially changed since the quote reforms made as a result of Governor Dayton's task force?
Well, that's a big question. I would say generally there were a few things that were put into the law which caused some significant changes, improvements, and there were a number of recommendations that were really core parts of the task force that have been rejected. I wouldn't say ignored. It's actively rejected by the department and the county. So the one example of positive changes we got it into the law as a result of the task force that all the counties have to use the same standards when responding to child maltreatment reports. And because we were only responding to 28% of calls, screening in 28% of calls statewide, compared to over 60% nationally. So that's like 10 or 15,000 kids a year that would be seen in an average state and weren't being seen here. So when that became a requirement that the department put out standards, and it's the only place that they have standards across the whole child protection and foster care continuum, we went from 28% up to like 43% of cases being screened in. So that brought in somewhere around 10,000 more kids a year that at least were getting a family assessment, which we don't have a lot of faith in, but they're at least getting somebody to see them. And it also, unintended consequences department, those cases are almost all 50% supported by Medicaid in terms of case management services. So it brought in about $100 million in federal money, which the state then had to match. So $200 million overall, 400 plus additional caseworkers statewide, brought the caseloads down. So a lot of ripple effects from that, just that one instance in which standards were set. But at the other end of the spectrum, the practices like interviewing children in front of the adults and not really having a required protocol, fact finding, and giving people advance notice of the initial child protection visit. You can see when you look at these cases that that's really continued to put kids at risk. As you saw, almost half of the people who were responsible for the fatalities were not the bio parents. So anybody in the household who's there can sit in on the interview of a child when they've been, accused, somebody in the household has been accused of abuse. It's just really, it's an inexplicable practice why we would ever even think about doing that. It wasn't the case years ago. Hennepin County, I don't think does that, but for the most part, that's the philosophy. So those kind of recommendations about just tightening down and making sure you have the facts and also putting the facts in the record, which hasn't been required in family assessment cases until this last year when we got some legislation passed on that point. So essentially recommendations that went counter to the family assessment philosophy were rejected, and ones that we got in the law have been honored and have made some significant improvements.
Yeah, sounds like some good progress, but still a long way to go, huh?
That's it in a nutshell, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Rich and Maya.
Just one other comment I'd like to make, Rich, if I may, and that is when you were just talking and Maya mentioned earlier about, close to 50% of the individuals that were responsible for the fatality were not biological parents. That raises another question that has to be looked at very carefully in analyzing this data, is that when you try to look at the connection between child protection involvement with the family prior to the death of the child, oftentimes the individual that was directly responsible for the death of the child was maybe somebody who did not have any child protection history prior to the fatality event, because the child protection history would oftentimes track with one or both of the parents, not necessarily with the, boyfriend that, came into the home at some point in time. So when you start analyzing this data, all I'm saying is you have to really kind of drill down and look at it carefully and not draw conclusions that are not necessarily supported. Now, any death is a problem. I'm not trying to excuse anything. I'm just saying sometimes the child protection history tracks with a parent who was not directly involved in the child death.
Yeah, I don't know if you can get back to that slide, Maya, but I would say that, so 27% were the significant other of the mother, and another 10% were the foster parents. And the ones where it was the significant other, at least in the cases we've read, and you've read some of them, I don't know if you read the exact same ones. There was an issue, the concept of the mother is responsible because of a failure to protect. That the mother is basically there, knows what's going on, but doesn't protect the child. That's a factor in a lot of them. So even if the person who was responsible for the death wasn't in child protection, it may have been known to child protection. And certainly, if it's a foster care placement, you've got the caseworker eyes on the situation. So it's only, I think, in those situations where maybe an uncle did it or something like that, was a relatively small number, that I think we're going to find that child protection was unaware of the risk that the child was.
I think you might have missed Greg's point there. If the boyfriend comes in the house after child protection involvement, if he wasn't in the home at the time the child protection was involved, they wouldn't know about him as a risk factor. And there's some data out of Denver from a number of years ago looking at their mortality, and the deaths by paramours were higher in older kids, whereas the death by biologic parent, well, particularly fathers versus boyfriends, fathers were more common in younger infants, and boyfriends became more common in the older kids, presumably because maybe, fathers didn't stick around long enough or whatever. But Greg's point, I think, is that if the boyfriend is the person who is ultimately responsible, child protection could have been involved with that family and had no idea that this guy was a factor because they can't see the future. And I think from the old Minnesota, like some of the older Minnesota mortality reports, if you looked at sort of the people responsible for the death, a number of them had themselves had prior contact with child protection, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that would be anything child protection would know if they didn't know that person was going to be in the home in the future.
Well, I would say, Mark, and I hesitate to go up against two of the best experts I know in the field and push back, but wouldn't it be true in a lot of those cases, or at least some of those cases, that the mother had a history of not protecting the child with boyfriends in the household, so that you knew the children, that the mother was not properly protecting the kids as a pattern?
Yeah, I would leave that to Greg, but my bet would be that the kind of failure to protect is a relatively small portion, is my guess. Like, my bet is that for families that had prior CPS involvement, it may have been around neglect, direct abuse, whatever, and maybe it would have been hard to predict whether that person was going to fail to protect in the future. But
I kind of just again support what Mark is saying, is that it's a lot easier in hindsight to look back and say, well, gee, the mother should have, as opposed to the projection or the predicament of looking forward and saying, yeah, I can see that this is a red flag and I shouldn't be entering into this relationship if I'm the mother. A lot of the situations that I reviewed where the boyfriend, or the cases I've seen over the years with the boyfriend involved, there's not necessarily any red flags about the boyfriend to begin with. Certainly in some families, there were red flags. But again, it's the kind of thing we have to be careful, is my bias, of not going too far down the road with conclusions without carefully looking at the case-by-case situation.
Well, I think, Maya, maybe we should take those cases where the significant other was the perpetrator, the one who killed a child, and just look at them in light of the questions that Greg and Mark are raising. But I would say, just from reading the cases myself, overall, there was so much history in these cases of, neglect and abuse, and so many instances where they got, called to the attention of child protection, that somebody should have had a safety plan in place and had more eyes on this case than they did. So, and that's my gestalt from reading all of these, and that doesn't mean you aren't right. I think we should go back and look and just dig into that particular issue ourselves a little more before we do the report. I mean, when it gets to the point where a child's killed, for the most part, except where somebody just lost it when the baby was crying, for the most part, there's a lot of stuff that happens before the child gets killed, right? And some of that stuff is known to child protection.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Okay, well, we'll see. We'll look at the report, but I think that, I don't know, Maya, would you agree with that? That in a lot of these cases, not most of them, there's just a lot of people who knew that something was going on, the kids weren't safe?
Yeah, I would say, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but at least out of the cases where, the children were killed by a domestic partner, it's the 24%. I would say at least half had reports made to child protection regarding the domestic violence in the home. So at least, to some extent, they knew what was going on. I think in a lot of those cases, some of the perpetrators would have, multiple DANCO violations in a really small time frame. I never really saw that those were necessarily being cross-reported to child protection all the time. So I don't know how much is on their
What's a
radar.
DANCO? You have to say what a DANCO is.
Domestic abuse, no contact order. But yeah, I think in general, it's a really interesting topic. Greg and I spent some time talking about it. Just, basically domestic violence in the home in terms of measuring, or, a child's safety versus a mother's safety. There's only so much you can do if a mom is unwilling to leave her abusive partner, or, so I guess, I don't know, at least from what I kind of understood from Greg, it kind of seemed like a kind of a tougher domestic violence in general, in terms of child safety is kind of a tough subject to wrap your head around.
Well, even inspired us to go and take a closer look at that number in those cases. But it was interesting. We did have domestic violence subject matter experts weigh in on this. And, somewhat predictably, they kind of looked at it from the point of view, well, why are you blaming the mom, when it was the boyfriend who killed the kid? But in the situation where that child was in danger for long periods of time because of the inaction of the mother, it seems to me that at some point you have to balance the child's safety against, not trying to force the woman to leave the guy or force her to take action. So that, I think, is an ongoing kind of point of, different points of view between domestic violence advocates and child protection advocates. But we appreciated their involvement. That was great. I wasn't even paying attention. We kind of run over away. So I think we probably ought to let people go on to whatever else they have to do in the day, not hold you. And I think as we go on, we'll get this report published, and then people can kind of poke holes in it or accept it. But I think for the most part, you're going to find it's pretty well documented and pretty solid.
Thank you for doing this, Maya.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
course.
All right,
Maya,
well-
is your report completely finished now?
No, it's going to be a few weeks. And then I think we'll just put it out right after the first of the year because we don't want to put it out in the middle of the holidays and not get any attention.
Yeah, it sounds like a good plan.
So first week in January is our target.
Yeah, I hope it gets out to a wide audience.
Well, we have some media that we hope that materializes. We'll see. So,
See you, Maya.
Happy holidays,
Congratulations on the
everyone.
wedding.
see y'all.
Yeah,
Happy
good work.
holidays.
Good work, Maya.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.